My PC just died, and so did my backup. What the f?
But this is a story for another time. This one's about my second backup, a G4560 that I ended up using for about 2 days recently. I got it back when it released in 2017 to replace my aging Q4660. Pentiums up until this point were only 2 cores on 2 threads, and lacked hyper-threading. They were Intel's cheapest desktop CPUs, and were mostly used for basic computing, although some ended up being popular for new budget or even entry-level gaming builds. If you wanted decent performance, you'd have to go with at least an i3, or a new CPU from a few generations ago. Hell, even the Q4660 was still popular and quite decent, and did have double the cores of a Pentium. The Pentiums really were reserved for new builds with a tight budget, but that was until the G4560. This processor was basically an i3 with the Pentium name, with 2 cores and 4 threads. The first 3 Pentiums at this point, and a frequency of 3.5 GHz, it really wasn't that far from the Skylake i3-6100. It did like the AVX instruction set, and didn't have boost clocks, but at the time, it wasn't really an issue yet. It played pretty much anything decently. This anomaly ended up being a sign of things to come for Intel. The next generation, which started upping card counts under the threat of Ryzen, which, while underperforming pretty much everywhere compared to Intel, was a massive step up compared to Bulldozer, and quickly caught up to fight and even surpass Intel a few generations later. But now, nearly 10 years later, how does a budget dual-core perform in today's games and environment? Most processors are at least 6 cores and 12 threads, with budget ones being more like the i7s of the past, 4 cores and 8 threads. It's easy to expect a quad-core to struggle, let alone a budget dual-core. Booting up this old machine, and my main Windows install was just way too old and bloated for this CPU. Everything was insanely slow and used 100% of the CPU. So I quickly moved to a secondary install, and here the desktop experience was immediately better. The computer was able to do computing stuff that computer users do, and I was able to watch Twitch just fine, so I did my computer things just fine. However, compared to my 12400F, it was definitely much slower. But let's get to the interesting part, games. The test system had an RX 6700XT, 16 GB of RAM DDR4 at 3200 MHz, although my B250 only wanted to run it at 2400, and obviously the good old Pentium. Starting with Counter-Strike 2, and the processor immediately showed its age. CS2, compared to CSGO and its competitors, is not very well optimized, but it became quite noticeable with the Pentium, with the lowest settings and a resolution by 1024x768. Yes, I actually still play like this. During a deathmatch, the average frame rate was of 42 and 1% loss of 22. The game was sluggish and aiming was hard enough, but spraying was nearly impossible. Since deathmatches are more demanding than the rest of the game, I started up by competitive with bots. Here the game was more playable with an average of 60 FPS and 1% of 51. Playing with bots is slightly more demanding than real players as the CPU had to simulate them, but I don't expect the difference to be noticeable. Overall, I don't think CS2 will be competitively viable on the CPU, and not that I expected that anyway, but it may be playable as long as you avoid deathmatches. And now it's Rust's turn. I was playing the game as my PC passed away, so having the game be playable would have been nice to keep my base up. But over the years, this game's optimization got worse and worse. After the abandoned Legacy, I kept playing this game using a Q6600, 9500 GT and 4GB of RAM, and back then it was perfectly playable. But nowadays, this game is a RAM hog, requiring a minimum of 16, maybe 12 gigs if you push it, but even then, the experience is not gonna be great. CPU-wise, it also got really demanding. I used to play New Rust with this Pentium when I still used it, and it was perfectly playable back then. But now, with medium-ish settings and render distance to the minimum, it averages about 25 FPS, with heavy stutters at times leading to 1% of just 1 FPS. I didn't really expect this, but Rust is pretty much unplayable on this. Moving on to a game that I didn't expect to be able to launch. Battlefield 6. This game is incredibly CPU demanding, being the one game that pushed my 12400F to 100 degrees when I still had the stock cooler despite my undervolt. There isn't that much to say about it though. With the lower settings, the game was hardly playable, running at 18 FPS with 1% of 6. The game was slow, hard to look at, and unplayable. Fortnite was interesting. I used to play this game just fine with this processor back in the day. I even used to max out the game while I'm benchmarked with low settings here. But with the default DX12 API, the game ran pretty well at an average of 78 FPS and with 1% of 5. That is completely ignoring the very slow loading screens and the map or anything else for that matter, pretty much refused to load. I then decided to use the performance mode and forced DirectX 11. Here the game was a lot more playable and way closer to what I remember it being, only with worse graphics. I was able to load the lobby, tents and drop wherever I wanted on the map, with everything loading as expected. The frame rate went up to 92 average and 10 for the 1% lows. Next up is Red Dead Redemption 2. Using the lowest settings and the broken backend, the game took its time to compile the shaders and everything was pretty much invisible for like 2 minutes. But once they compiled, the game was sort of playable with an average of 32 and 1% of 14. It wasn't great, but sufficient to play the game. The frame rate was also a bit higher outside of town in the nature, although I did not run a separate benchmark for that, it was alright. Cyberpunk is next and on the edge of being playable, at 32 average and 14.1%. It might just be because I got used to the high performance and that I'm using a 400Hz screen, but despite the frame rate not being that horrible, including 1%, I would not really consider it playable. Everything is a correct speed, aiming isn't that bad, frame pacing even felt fine, but it wasn't really that good overall. So while I think you could play the game like this, it wouldn't be very good, and I think that may be due to it being a first-person shooter. Next up is a game that shows why an i3 would have been a better choice due to FEX being supported. Starfield just did not launch. Yeah, I wasn't gonna give up here though. Using Intel software to emulate different CPU architectures, I got to launch the game and even load the intro, and I was kind of surprised. I mean, it wasn't playable, but I got in-game and could move around without crashing. I probably could have gone through the intro entirely, but I'm not gonna do that at this FPS. This really makes me wanna try emulation with more powerful, but older CPUs. That could be interesting. Dead by Daylight is another game I used to play using not only this processor, but also my G4560 back then. And it was perfectly playable, but how about now? Well, the game is doing alright with an average of 42 FPS, but the 1% are really bad at just 1 FPS. I don't know whether to blame the game or Windows getting more demanding, but it wasn't as playable as it used to be. Overall, it seems the CPU isn't good for much anymore, but I didn't stop there. Linux is getting more popular thanks to mainly the Steam Deck and Windows 11 being filled with AI. It is also known that CPU performance is better on Linux, so I tried a few games here as well, starting with Cyberpunk, and the results are pretty much the same as Windows. The game doesn't feel any better and the frame rate is within margin of error at 32 FPS average and 16.1%. CS is a little more playable, deathmatches almost not feeling completely horrible with an average of 59 and 1% of 35. I didn't test a more competitive environment, but it's likely more bearable now. And then I finally tried Dead by Daylight, and the game actually became playable with an average of 49 and 1% of 30, which is a massive improvement in the 1%. It was still noticeably worse than my actual computer, and as a result felt bad, but I'm sure that for someone that's not used to higher frame rates, it would be perfectly fine. So, overall, is a dual core still usable in 2026? Well, sort of. For a casual gamer, it might be perfectly usable, but even then, whether it's used or new, there are much better options, no matter the price range. Processors with less than 4 physical cores are pretty much a thing of the past now thanks to Ryzen, and there is pretty much no reason to get something like this anymore. A Sci-Fi from the same era should be just as cheap, yet much more capable. Maybe it's time to revisit this one too.